Chapter 3. Captain Henley was leaning back in the cushioned chair of his quarters. He wanted badly to prop his feet up on the desk, but that was a habit he had broken himself of when he became captain. He did not feel it was proper for a starship commander to have that habit. Despite the urge and the privacy of his quarters, he resisted that desire and merely stared at the view screen displaying the new orders again. Henley never could understand why the Constitution-class ships were always assigned to these type of missions when there were other types of cruisers in the fleet. But he had to admit that was wrong. He did know why. He just didn't want to admit to the truth. The familiar shape and the type of individuals that commanded them were well known for doing the impossible, all the way from the Tholians to the Romulan Empire. Just the name of the ship class carried a great deal of respect and authority, no matter which ship or captain it actually was. Henley knew it was probably only a matter of time for the name Enterprise to be on any ship that Starfleet determined to be the newest and the best of the Federation. Henley sighed as he read the orders once more. At least with these orders, he thought, I should be able to make a name for myself, even if the orders do come from Starfleet Intelligence. There was only one thing Henley despised about the orders. They reactivated the status of Kirk and his companions. Henley just knew that Kirk would be unbearable more than he already was. But Henley smiled as he leaned back in his chair until it creaked at the limit. They were only to act as advisors. Despite Kirk's years of experience as a starship captain, Henley still retained full command, a fact that Henley knew Kirk wouldn't like one bit. In fact, Henley hoped the news might give the old man a heart attack. He glanced at the chronometer and saw that he had 2.5 hours before the formal dinner for Kirk and his companions. He slowly reached over to activate the ship's comm to call the bridge. I might as well inform Phelps and Kirk now and get it over with, he thought, as Lieutenant Foley came on. Lieutenant Foley, is Commander Phelps back on the bridge yet? The filtered voice affirmed the assumption. Good. Have him and Captain Kirk report to my quarters immediately. Mr. Coulser, Henley waited for the automatic bridge comm system to switch over to the helm station. Leave Vulcan orbit as soon as we have clearance and proceed to the triangle at warp 6. I will give you specific coordinates later. Henley out. Henley finally decided to prop his feet up on the corner of his desk and smiled as he waited, ignoring his previous determination to break his old habit. Maybe he wouldn't mind this mission so much after all. Phelps buzzed the door chime within minutes, entering with a look of anxiety on his face. Typical, Henley thought. Phelps was still new enough to the first officer position that any mission seemed to be of major importance to him. But then again, Henley remembered that Phelps' last assignment had been 2 years on a deep space relay station. After a tour like that, anything would be of interest. Kirk followed a minute later, wearing the face of a man who had been called away from something that he had just soon not have left, and definitely wanted to get back to as soon as possible. For once, Henley could agree with the older man's thoughts. He would just as soon have Kirk somewhere else too, preferably outside the ship. Henley motioned for the two to sit down. Gentlemen, he didn't look at Kirk. I called you both here to brief you on the transmission I received from Starbase 10 concerning a change in our current duty. A change, sir? Phelps asked. Of what nature? Henley sighed. Sometimes Phelps' impatience was tiring. The Romulans have apparently stirred up some trouble in the Triangle, which may involve the Klingons as well. The Enterprise has orders from SFIC to investigate. Intelligence Command wants you to investigate something in the Triangle? Kirk questioned. That's very odd, taking into account that they have many of their own operatives in the field. But why call me? Surely you're going to drop us off at Starbase 10 before going into the Triangle. Henley shook his head with an earnest frown. Negative. IC has had you and your companions reactivated for this mission. You and your crew will, however, only act as advisors. He stared at Kirk. I still retain command of the ship. Kirk turned red in the face at Henley's self-importance. He stuck a finger at Henley. Look, Captain, he said, not hiding his anger. I don't give a damn about whether you have control of this mission or not. And whether I think you are deserving or not, you are in command of the ship. What I want to know is who gave the reactivation orders." Henley was somewhat disappointed in Kirk's attitude. He had hoped that Kirk would challenge his authority so he could have him thrown in the brig. He sighed to himself. That was apparently one wish that wouldn't come true. "Kirk, I am in charge of the mission and the ship," he said coolly. "As for your status, I suggest you talk to Admiral Preston on Starbase 10. You have 18 hours before I am given the mission specs, and if, by some chance, you manage to convince the Admiral to change his mind," he smiled, "then I'll be more than happy to drop you and your companions off at the Senior Care Center on Starbase 10. Kirk rose so quickly from the chair that Phelps thought he was actually going to punch Henley. Phelps had been worried over the possibility that Kirk may actually hit Henley, not so much because of the amount of damage that Henley might receive, but rather if he would actually intervene on Henley's behalf. Instead of punching Henley, Kirk just left the room in a huff, and Phelps let out a sigh of relief. He looked at his captain, who was leaning in his chair and grinning as the doors closed behind Kirk. "Sir," Phelps asked respectfully, "permission to speak freely." Henley looked at Phelps with a raised eyebrow, but nodded for him to go ahead. "Sir, whatever you think about Kirk, he is not trying to take your command away from you. Perhaps you could ease up on the phaser barrage." Henley's smile faded rapidly. "Lon, Kirk now has seniority over me, and technically he could take over the center seat if anything serious comes up. Now, I don't mind him being a passenger, nor do I mind if he stays on as a mission advisor, as long as he stays that way." Henley sat up in his chair. "But if he tries to take the con, he'll get one hell of a fight from me first." Henley's eyes burned steadily into his first officer. "And that, Commander, is how I stand with Mr. James T. Kirk." Phelps knew right then that this was going to be a rough mission, regardless of what happened outside the ship. He stood up from the desk. "Understood, sir. Will that be all?" he asked as he stood up to leave. "Yes, Commander. That will be all for now," he answered as he watched Phelps turn. "You know, Commander, I'm sure there was someone who told Will Decker the same thing you just told me." Phelps paused at that, but didn't respond as he continued out the door. Once the door slid shut, the man stopped. He knew Will Decker only by stories that passed around the academy and what Henley had told him. Henley himself had known Decker as a freshman. Decker was in the graduating class. Even though the classes normally did not mix, Henley and Decker had apparently met and for some reason hit it off. When Decker had been reporting as missing during the V'ger incident, Henley had blamed losing his friend on Kirk. He fully believed that Kirk purposely did something to get Decker out of the way permanently, so he could have the Enterprise, and no one could convince him otherwise. Perhaps that was the real reason for Henley's hostility towards Kirk. Phelps finally shook his head. It wasn't any of his business either way. Duty awaited. James Kirk sat in front of the small console-sized view screen in his quarters. On the screen was Admiral John Preston, who, at 68 years of age, was one of the last admirals that was around Kirk's age. Jim Kirk studied the face of the man before him. Preston hadn't changed that much since they last met. Perhaps a little more gray hair, but that was it. "John," Kirk started, doing his best not to show his anger over Henley's remark. In his younger days, Kirk would have removed Henley's smile from his face with a fist. "Why the devil did you pull this stunt of having me and my crew reinstated and put on a mission again? We've served our time and more. And don't give that story about the Enterprise being the only starship in the area. I know better." Preston frowned at the not-so-unexpected complaint. "Now, Jim," he replied in a calming tone, "you know as well as I do that as a Starfleet officer, you can be called back to duty if an emergency arises. That's what's come up in the Triangle. And you're right, the Enterprise isn't the only starship in the area. But taking into account that you and your crew were aboard, it was decided that you could serve as advisors. We need someone out there with some experience." You mean you need someone out here that can handle the ship in an emergency because you don't think Captain Henley can? Kirk responded, thoroughly disgusted with the situation. No, Preston answered with a slight shake of his head. Henley is a competent officer, but he hasn't had any experience in dealing with Romulans and Klingons. Not many of our newer captains have, you know. At least, not like you and your crew. That is why I want you there as an advisor. Competent officer? Kirk asked as he leaned closer to the view screen. John, the man's a wormhole. He's so paranoid that I'm going to take the ship over that he's developing ulcers. Kirk had just caught himself, in time, and not tell Preston about Henley needing DPM. That was not in his jurisdiction yet. Or maybe it's just that you can't stand the thought of having someone else in command of a ship that you're on and isn't a friend of yours, Preston said. That's bull, and you know it, Kirk almost shouted, though deep down he wondered how much of that was the truth. It's not who's the captain of the ship. It's putting my people back on active duty like this. It was bad enough having to go through what we did 3 months before we retired. But now, Kirk gave a wearied look. We've earned a rest, John. Preston straightened up in his chair. I'm sorry, Captain Kirk, but the orders stand. This mission may prevent an all-out war with the Romulans, and possibly the Klingons. Nobody wants war, especially with the new peace talks we're having with the Klingons. Preston let out a knowing sigh. And with the rift forming within the Klingon Empire over who should really be in charge of their council, we don't need any unnecessary incidents. However, if it'll ease your mind any, since they were in the area, I've assigned Captains Sulu and Chekhov to be your backup. I have also alerted the starships Benton, Starwood, and Luna to move into positions where they will be able to assist if need be. But all ships will stay out of the way unless absolutely necessary to prevent any unnecessary posturing. Preston leaned closer to the screen. Jim, you have to understand, this has the potential for a major explosion, and we need the best we have out there on top of it. Whether you like it or not, you and your crew are the best that we have. The Admiral gave a slight smile. Good luck, Jim. Preston out. Kirk leaned back in his chair with a grim frown. Apparently, Starfleet was taking whatever was going on very seriously. Having the Enterprise go in was one thing, but assigning an additional 5 starships on hand, that was significant. Having Sulu and Chekhov for backup did help ease his mind some. The other ships he only halfway knew. The Starwood was a Shanley-class frigate under the command of Captain Norchuk, who had earned his command after several years in Starfleet's Marine Corps. The Benton was a Remora-class escort. At a distance, it wasn't good at a fight, but at close range, it could bring its 8 phaser banks to bear and do considerable damage. The Durrett-class cruiser Luna would also be nice for backup. Although he didn't know the captains of those 2 ships, and only very little about Chuck, Kirk decided that even if they were 2 cadets and a trained chimpanzee, they would be better than Henley. Kirk propped his feet up on the desk, thinking. It suddenly dawned on him that in a short time he would have a mission probably a great deal worse than the one from IC. That of telling his friends about the change in plans, and that was not a welcome act. He especially dreaded telling Scott, and worse still, McCoy. Kirk frowned as he pondered the need for stopping by the arsenal to pick up a phaser and have it set on heavy stun when he told McCoy the news. The formal dinner came and went, with very little in the way of conversation to change the dismal atmosphere. Fortunately for Henley, Kirk had spent the previous 2 hours calming down Scott and McCoy. At one point in time, Kirk had wished he'd gone to the arsenal for that phaser. Spock had accepted the information in his usual logical way. Uhura was just dumbfounded. The atmosphere during the dinner was heavy, and even Uhura's comment about how, during the last formal dinner they had, the guests didn't even use utensils. Scott McCoy gave a very short laugh. Spock raised an eyebrow, not exactly relishing the memories of that night. Kirk was just glad there wasn't Romulan ale being served at this dinner. He was still hot over Henley's little attitude, and some Romulan ale may have just served to loosen up his fists. Henley, for himself, remained quiet during the whole meal, but kept giving Kirk quick glances, knowing that he was somehow plotting to take command. First Officer Phelps was glad when the dinner was over. He was worried all through the meal he would have to break up a fight between Kirk and Henley. It was not until 10:30 hours that Henley received a communication from Starbase 10. The scrambled signal required a retinal scan before the transmission continued. Once cleared, the face of the commander of the Triangle Sector Intelligence Division appeared, Commodore White Peterson. Henley studied the white-haired man before him, trying to gain some insight on the mission by the expression on his face, but there was none to read. The man wore a face of stone that would have made any Vulcan proud to have, if they could feel such a thing as pride. Henley could not find any emotion at all in the facial features of Peterson. "Captain Henley," Peterson asked formally, "is Captain Kirk there with you?" "No, sir," he responded as a knot formed in his stomach. "Have him report at once. Since he is acting as an advisor, this information also concerns him." "Yes, sir," Henley replied, trying not to show his resentment of the need of Kirk's presence. His hand hit the comm paddle, a little harder than was necessary. "Lieutenant Foley, page Captain Kirk, and have him report to my quarters at once." He turned off the comm line and turned back to the view screen. "Sir, about having Captain Kirk as an advisor." "Ah, yes," Peterson smiled. "It's a good thing that he's on board. Make sure you avail yourself of his experience. It can prove very helpful if situations arise that involve either the Klingons or the Romulans." "Yes, sir," Henley replied, somewhat frustrated. Peterson's reply wasn't exactly what Henley was thinking. He prepared to follow up further, but the sound of the doors opening and closing alerted him to Kirk's presence, even before he saw his reflection in the view screen. That was fairly quick. Kirk sat down next to Henley without a word or a look in his direction. A glance at the view screen, however, caused a smile. "White, when did you get raised from the meager depths of being a space monkey to such a cushy office job?" Henley groaned inwardly. Great. Kirk knows the Commodore on a first-name basis. Peterson smiled. "Oh, about 2 years ago, Jim. How have you been since the great vacation?" Kirk smiled back weakly. "I don't know. I haven't had much time to spend on vacations yet." "I know," Peterson nodded in understanding. "But orders are orders." "I take it that means you have more specific information about the problem in the Triangle, sir." The Commodore looked in Henley's direction as Kirk just slowly shook his head. "Yes, Captain Henley. A few things have occurred in the Triangle that we were unaware of during your first contact about this. We have new information showing that the problem started when a Romulan scout ship went to Ganeth 2. Henley began to his command staff as Kirk's companions listened in. "Is where we are heading after we meet up with another ship in the Triangle that has more detailed information than what I'm going to give you." "Why another ship, sir, and not just send us information?" Henley looked at his navigator, Nyberry. "Because, Lieutenant, Starfleet doesn't want the entire galaxy to know what we're doing, of which," he continued quickly, annoyed at being interrupted, "I'm going to inform you, if I may." Barry turned somewhat red from embarrassment and a little bit of anger from being talked down to by Henley. "Now," Henley began again, "apparently a small Romulan force went to the planet Ganeth 2 and demanded that the people there give up some item or substance, which they refused to do. The Romulans gave them a deadline to change their minds, or they would come back and take what they wanted by force. The Romulans then left. That was approximately 6 standard days ago." "And it took this long," Phelps asked, "for Starfleet to decide to investigate the situation?" "Actually," Kirk started, "Ganeth only informed Starfleet 3 days ago. It has taken that long for command to decide on the proper steps to take." Kirk's voice was one of "that's typical" tone. "You have to remember, Commander," he continued, "we are talking about the Triangle. which is just one big neutral zone for the Romulans, Klingons, Federation, and with the Orions tossed in for good measure. The potential for this incident to lead to a major confrontation is beyond words. Indeed, I would estimate the odds to a confrontation resulting in war between either empire to be... Please, Spock, McCoy cut in. We don't need to hear you rant about the odds. He turned to Kirk after getting a stony look from McCoy. What about this ship that we're supposed to meet? Henley smiled somewhat when McCoy cut off Spock. Maybe the doctor wasn't all that bad. Captain Henley shook his head slightly as he responded. I can't give you much detailed information about that, Doctor. The ship's name is the Ravager. It is under command of Captain J.F. Savage. Savage? Phelps queried in an unbelieving tone. Yes. Do you know him, Commander? Henley asked, puzzled at Phelps' incredulous tone. Aye, sir. He taught a course at Starfleet concerning starship battle tactics during my graduating year. He paused a moment, then continued. Well, he did for a semester before he quit. He quit teaching after one semester? Why? Scott asked. He had taught several classes at the academy, and while not challenging, it was not so unbearable as to quit. I believe it had something to do with 2 or 3 of the long-term instructors informing Savage that he had no business to teach tactics that were not standard approved maneuvers. It was my impression, Phelps continued, that he liked doing things his own way, and while some of his tactics were, he paused for a moment as if trying to find the right word, let's say, unique, his strategies were brilliant. True, they were not standard fleet maneuvers, but they did work. Coulser, the helm officer, spoke up. If I remember correctly, he was the captain of a Ranger-class scout, and then he was later relieved of command when he did some type of illegal trading with one of the Orion families. Phelps shook his head with a remembrance of related knowledge. No, he wasn't relieved. Savage turned in his resignation instead of facing a court-martial. That was about a year after he quit the academy. The last rumor I heard was that he had gotten a trade ship from the Orions and was trading in the Triangle. And that's our informant? McCoy asked, to nobody in particular. All I know is that IC told me Savage was the one that originally received a transmission from Ganeth and sent it to Starbase 10, Henley answered. He then realized that his response had been worded as such to leave out Kirk's presence during Peterson's briefing. He hadn't intended to do so on purpose, but decided not to make the necessary apology, especially since Kirk had apparently not noticed the omission. Spock steepled his fingers. It could be that Captain Savage is a member of Intelligence Command, and that his resignation was simply a cover for covert operations in the Triangle. Kirk nodded. He had heard many things about Savage himself. The man was noted for being an insubordinate, rebellious officer that wanted to do everything but standard procedure, yet he was also known for being very loyal to Starfleet. His tactical maneuvers were also well known among the brass, but all that information came from back when Kirk was still an admiral, a lifetime ago. There is no evidence to support your theory, Captain Spock, Henley said, nor to prove it is wrong. If he is working for IC, Commodore Peterson didn't see that it was important enough to tell Miss. He then turned to the whole group. At any rate, our mission is to find out exactly what is going on and to try to settle it without military confrontation. As Captain Kirk said, this has the potential of becoming a major event, and Starfleet wants to avoid that at all costs. But, Kirk added, if this does turn out to be more than some type of trade dispute, we have been assigned some backup that we can call in. Sulu and Chekhov? Uhura asked, assuming that's who it would be, since they were also originally going to Danis and would be in the area anyway. Yes, Kirk replied. 3 other ships have also been ordered to patrol close by. Kirk looked at Henley. Upon saying he did not have anything to add, Kirk opened the table to discussion. Just what are our limitations on this mission? Kirk looked at Phelps. Fair question, he thought before answering. As Captain Henley said, we are trying to resolve this peacefully. Starfleet Command is still trying to decide how to handle this. Much of what they use to make a decision will be based on what we find. But, Henley continued, since the triangle is a designated neutral zone, our hands are somewhat tied by treaty. Ganeth is a triangle world, and thus cannot be made a Federation planet per se. But if they call for our help against the Romulans, we can provide some aid under the terms of the treaty. But Romulans don't necessarily follow the rules on neutral zone treaties to begin with, Kirk added, which may be why IC is involved in this, since they can do more covertly than we can openly. Once we have ascertained the situation, we are to report back to IC. What do we know about Ganeth itself? Henley glanced at Coulter, gave a slight nod, then turned to the control panel next to him. I'll project the planet's position within the triangle, so that all of you can see exactly where it is. The group turned to a wall-mounted view screen as it lit up with the information. A star field was displayed, divided into 4 sections, with several names around the dots that represented star systems. The area was divided by colors. Outlined in red was the Klingon side of the triangle. On the opposite side, connecting to the rear, was the green outline of the Romulan side. The forward portion in blue marked the Federation's perimeter. The 3 spheres of influence formed a rough triangle in the center, marked as neutral. Just within Federation space was another area, a small rough sphere of yellow marked Orion space. A red dot appeared in the triangle, close to the rear and towards the Romulan side of the zone. It was labeled as Ganeth Star System. This is the Ganeth Star System, Kirk began. As you can see, it is deep in the zone and closest to the Romulan side. Ganeth 2 is a Class M world orbiting a medium-sized orange star. Its society is agrarian-based, and their main crop being a wheat-like grain called Li, of which some 800 million tons are exported per year throughout the triangle. However, the market value is low, and Ganeth just does make a profit from the sale. The people of Ganeth, Henley picked up, are human and are known for leading a simple way of existence, with the minimal use of technology. That fact is somewhat strange, as data suggests that at one time, Ganeth had a fairly modern technological system in the use of energy, transportation, and machinery. In fact, the starships they use to transport their grain is of their own design, and was built on the planet a few hundred years ago. Spock raised an eyebrow. Strange that the populace appears to have abandoned their technology, one which would allow them to lead a life of higher prosperity. Such technical advances that they apparently had made would have increased the yield of their crops, and thus reduced their capital investments, resulting in higher profits. McCoy looked at Spock. Maybe they just got tired of letting machines do all the work. We have seen similar things occur. Spock's eyebrow rose slightly as he nodded, somewhat surprised at McCoy's logical comment. He dismissed the incident as perhaps being a side effect of McCoy having his Katra. Yes, we have, Doctor, Spock replied. But usually in smaller societies, or in those societies that were faced with some sort of environmental or social problem. It would be illogical for a planet like Ganeth, who exports large amounts of agricultural goods, to settle for a small profit, when the technology is available to grow larger crop yields, and thus a higher profit margin. Money isn't everything, Captain Spock, Phelps commented, but you raise an interesting question. It may be that some disaster caused them to abandon their technology for manual labor, or it may be that the people just found themselves getting lost in technology and decided to go back to the simpler, less complicated ways of their ancestors. Perhaps so, Commander, Spock nodded slightly, but it is still illogical to turn down the possible benefits. Captain, the Vulcan started, then noticed the attentive looks from both Kirk and Henley. Spock quickly corrected himself. Captains. We should inform the other ships of our briefing and data so they will not, he paused for a second. I believe the phrase is, get caught with their pants down? He looked at Kirk and almost formed a slight smile. Kirk was fond of saying that phrase. Henley looked at Spock as though he had just said the most ridiculous thing possible. But he said nothing to the Vulcan. Instead, he turned to Foley. Make sure that the other ships get a transcript of the information that we have. Foley acknowledged the order without a word. She had been recording the briefing for just such a reason, as per Henley's order before the meeting, a fact that Henley seemed to not want to make an issue of. With no further comments, the officers were dismissed and sent back to duty. Kirk and his quartet, as they were now being called, decided to go to the rec room to discuss the mission and any special problems that may arise, or comments in general. The meeting did not last long, however, as Scott brought up the fact that unless Kirk was in charge, Henley wouldn't take any advice, and Maxwell certainly wouldn't listen to him in engineering. Spock merely commented that there was little to theorize on without more information. Kirk could only nod a reluctant agreement to such facts. Finally, he dismissed everyone but McCoy. McCoy wore the face of someone who had just been sent to the principal's office, but didn't know why. "What's up, Jim?" "Would you mind telling me what the secret is between you and Spock?" Kirk asked, trying to sound as if he knew more than he actually did. McCoy acted surprised. "What secret are you talking about, Jim?" "Don't act as though you don't know what I'm talking about. It has something to do about Savick." McCoy shook his head. "I haven't the faintest idea what you're talking about. I haven't seen Savick since we left Vulcan for Earth, same as you." "Come off it, Bones. I could tell that Spock was holding something back in the turbo lift, and the way he looked at you when I mentioned Savick's name means that you know something I don't." McCoy was silent for a moment. "I'm sorry, Jim, but I have no idea what you're talking about. But if you think something's up, go ask Spock." "All right, Doctor," he said, not knowing whether to be angry at McCoy's lack of trust, or embarrassed at having called his friend very nearly a liar. "Have it your way." Kirk got up and left with a tinge of red on his face from frustration. "Sorry, Jim," McCoy said quietly, as he watched Kirk leave in a slight huff. This was definitely going to be a hard subject to keep quiet about. Nonetheless, it was Spock's place, not his, to let Kirk know about Savick. Within hours, the Enterprise neared a triangle. Kirk sat uneasily in a chair just off the science station on the bridge, where Commander Phelps was stationed. He was still fuming about McCoy, but was now really in a bad mood. He resented being set off in the corner like some cadet that couldn't handle his job, and being forced to watch how real officers worked. Kirk looked around the bridge for the 100th time. Henley had totally and quietly ignored his presence on the bridge since he came up. Henley made no effort to hide his feelings that Kirk should be seen, but not heard. James Kirk glanced at the chronometer above the view screen. In 5 minutes they would be skirting the edge of the triangle. In another 10 they would rendezvous with the mysterious Captain Savage. It was then that a flashing indicator light at the communications console caught Kirk's attention. Foley hit the button at the same time, called Henley's attention. "Captain Henley, I'm picking up a distress signal from the triangle, approximately 20 degrees off our present course. Audio only, sir." "Put it on, Lieutenant," Henley ordered, as he glanced in her direction, acting as though Kirk was invisible. At first, there was nothing but static. Then a badly garbled, low-volume message echoed from the speaker. "To any ship in the area, this is the Orion courier ship Dayton. We are under attack from a Klingon vessel. Please help us. We are unarmed and have received damage to our life support. Our shields are collapsing. If we take any more hits, we're..." Abrupt static replaced the voice, causing Henley to turn around to Foley, who shook her head helplessly. First Officer Phelps cast a look toward Kirk, then at Henley. "Do we help them?" Henley thought a moment. "What do sensors show, Commander?" he asked Phelps. Phelps operated the science station almost as well as Spock, Kirk thought. Then the hairs on Kirk's neck began to feel on end, causing him to get nervous. "Sir, there is a small ship. By configuration, a warp shuttle, probably Pulsar class. It is being pursued and fired upon by another ship. Scans confirm it is a Klingon K-17 Deathstalker class scout." Phelps continued to relay the sensor data. "It is closing on the shuttle. The shuttle has sustained damage to her power systems, life support, and shields." Henley spun around in the command chair to face the star-streaked view screen. Mr. Coulter, put that area up on visual, maximum magnification. Coulter replied with an answer and worked the sensor controls. The view changed from an incoming star pattern to what appeared to be empty space. Suddenly, bright green streaks of energy highlighted a nearly invisible small gray dot with a courier ship in the upper right-hand corner. The green energy bolts were apparently disruptor fire from a more distant and still invisible Klingon ship. Mr. Foley, warn that Klingon ship off, Henley ordered as another green streak lit the darkness of space. Coulter, plot an intercept course with the shuttle and prepare to lock on the tractor beam. Henley turned to face the weapons and tactical station. Lieutenant Turner, raise shields and go to red alert. Charge main phasers and load forward torpedo tubes. Kirk got up rapidly and walked down to Henley's position. He spoke quietly but in a stern tone. Henley, this may be a setup by the Klingons to get us in neutral space so they can attack. Henley frowned at the unwanted device, but thought on what Kirk had said. He stared at the screen as the two ships came closer. The Klingon scout ship was now close enough to see as it fired another disruptor volley. The beams appeared very much like a green lightning bolt as it hit directly aft of the shuttle. A green energy umbrella formed as the disruptor hit what was left of the deflector shields, but almost instantly collapsed, allowing energy to damage the ship. Your shields have just collapsed, sir. They've taken moderate damage to their hull, Turner replied. Henley looked back at Kirk. The Klingons wouldn't fire on their own ship like that, he said in an undeserved but authoritative tone. Sir, they fired again. Henley turned back at Coulter's call and saw the last disruptor beam strike the port side of the shuttle, metal and energy spattering off in the cold of space. The hit caused the shuttle to decelerate and list to the port side momentarily. Go to impulse, Helm. Bring phasers to bear on target as soon as possible. Aye, sir. 84 seconds until we reach maximum phaser range. But against their shields, it won't pack much of a punch. Minimal damage range in 105 seconds. Don't be a fool, Henley, Kirk said a bit louder than he intended. It's a trap, just like the Kobayashi Maru scenario. As soon as we cross the border into neutral space, the Klingon will fire on us, not the shuttle. That will be all, Captain Kirk, Henley told Kirk as he leaned over the command chair, just inches in front of Kirk's face. I am in command of this ship, and I give the orders. If you can't stand that fact, then get off my bridge. Kirk's right hand formed a tightly clenched fist, but he held off from knocking Henley out of the command chair, despite what his gut was telling him. Instead, he stepped back, red-faced, putting Henley safely out of his striking range. Send the shuttle, Henley ordered. This is Captain Henley of the Federation starship Enterprise. Maintain your heading and we will intercept. Another green lightning bolt issued from the scout and contacted the shuttle, causing it to tilt at a 45-degree angle. The Dayton now wore a sparkling black streak from aft to bow on the port side. The ship slowly moved forward due to momentum, but all power was lost. Mr. Turner, fire phasers, Henley commanded, knowing that the shuttle would never reach Federation space unless they did something. Turner did as ordered, knowing that a hit at this distance would be a lucky shot, even with the computerized targeting. The fury of the Enterprise was unleashed as the phasers fired. The twin beams of orange-yellow energy lit the underside of the primary hull as the beams stabbed outward into the black void. Both beams knifed through space toward a Klingon ship, only one hitting, and it was a glancing blow at that. The phased energy rapidly dissipated on the Klingon deflector shields. There was no damage done, but the Deathstalker pivoted to the starboard, headed back into the triangle, and hazed into invisibility as it cloaked. Good shot, Mr. Turner, Henley said with enthusiasm. Lieutenant Foley, can you raise the shuttle now? Yes, sir, but it's audio only and a poor reception at that, she replied, as the speaker filled with quiet static. Cracking sounds filled the bridge before a voice finally came through. Of the courier ship Dayton. Thanks for the assist, Captain Henley, but we have suffered heavy damage. Can you tow us into Federation space and call our base so that we can send a ship for us? Henley turned off the comm, still feeling Kirk's hot stare in the back of his head. Commander Phelps, scan the shuttle, please. Phelps nodded as he turned to his scanners. 5 life forms aboard. Slight damage to the hull. No danger of a breach. Propulsion systems are down, and life support is functioning at low levels. No weapon systems are apparent, and the deflectors are down. The reply stopped as he adjusted the sensors. That's odd. There appears to be about 20 or so canisters or containers in their hold. They are shielded from sensor scan, and I cannot determine what they contain. Henley raised an eyebrow. Shielded cargo? Well, this close to Orion space, probably something illegal. The captain opened the comm back up. Dayton, what is the nature of the cargo that you are carrying? There was silence for several seconds, and Henley had started to wonder if his transmission had finally gone through. Finally, a voice came back. Enterprise. Our manifest cannot be disclosed, as we are a private courier. However, I can assure you it is nothing illegal or dangerous. Henley smiled slightly. I just bet it's not. He glanced at the chronometer. Dayton, we will come in and tractor you out into Federation space and see to some emergency repairs to get you on your way. Henley out. Captain Henley closed the channel and turned to his helmsman. Set course for the shuttle at half impulse. Lock on tractor beams when in range. Once we have them, turn about and head back. Kirk stepped closer to Henley's irritatingly all-knowing face. Don't do it, Henley. You're risking the ship and crew on this. It's a trap to get us in neutral space so they can attack. Henley gritted his teeth. That was it. He had been decent for long enough. Kirk, get off my bridge. When I want your advice, I will call for you. Kirk's face turned red hot again as the anger rose. His right hand was still clenched in a fist, but this time he stood firm and stared Henley in the face, waiting. Commander Phelps, Henley called, seeing that Kirk was not going to back down this time, and the entire bridge crew was being apprehensive as to what to do. Escort Mr. Kirk off my bridge. Have security help if need be. Henley had said that with enough authority to let everyone know he was dead serious. Phelps was stunned for the moment, but finally walked up to Kirk. This way, if you please, Captain Kirk. He motioned to the turbo lift. Kirk was too angry to think of anything to say to Henley that he would not also follow up with a punch in the face. He quickly strode to the turbo lift, reluctantly followed by Phelps. As the doors slid shut, he could hear Henley repeating his order to move toward the shuttle. Kirk looked at Phelps in minor disappointment. He could have backed me up, Kirk thought. He doesn't seem to be so inexperienced as to not see what was going to happen. Commander, you know I was right, Kirk finally spoke. Phelps nodded slightly. Yes, sir. It did seem as though the Klingon ship departed rather abruptly, without finishing off the shuttle, when it was still out of range of our phasers. Yet you didn't say anything to back me up, Kirk said in a bitter tone. Phelps recognized Kirk's disappointment. Captain Henley is my commanding officer, sir, and whether I agree with his opinions or not, there is no evidence that he acted in any other way than correct procedure. Besides, I have found that once he makes his mind up and wants to prove a point, it would take an admiral just to get him to listen to reason. Kirk shook his head slightly. Phelps was another of the Academy's by-the-book officers. He had apparently misjudged Phelps as being above that. A sudden jerk of the turbo lift slammed Kirk against Phelps as the two hit the wall with force. The sound of explosions and buckling metal above could be heard. The lights flickered off. Darkness, then dim red light shone through smoke-filled air as the emergency lighting came on. The smell of ozone from electrical shorts began to make itself noticed. Computer, halt and return to the bridge, Kirk ordered, as he followed his order with a hit to the manual destination buttons. Unable to comply, came the response. Access to the bridge has been blocked. Kirk made a quick slam on the wall. Commander, if that's what I think it was, we need to get to the auxiliary bridge and get the ship out of here. I agree, Phelps responded, wiping blood from under his nose. Computer, reroute to the auxiliary bridge at emergency speed. He turned to Kirk. We had better get your crew there also. Kirk nodded. Computer, shipwide call for Captain Spock and Scott, Commander Uhura, and Dr. McCoy to go to the auxiliary bridge on the double. All crew to emergency stations. Medical and emergency tech crews to the main bridge immediately. Begging your pardon, sir, Phelps interjected. Just your crew to report? Shouldn't the entire standby bridge crew also report? Not now, Commander. No offense, but I know my crew, and they know me. I don't have time to do a crash course on who's who to give orders to. Believe me, it's not personal. But this is an unknown emergency, and I need people that can anticipate what I need. Aye, sir, Phelps said, somewhat relieved at the answer. I understand and support your decision. The turbo lift stopped after a few moments. Kirk and Phelps did not even wait for the doors to fully slide open before jumping through. They ran down the red-lighted, smoke-filled corridor to the auxiliary bridge. Once in, Phelps manned the scanners while Cook stood behind him impatiently. The Dayton is not within scanning range, but there is a debris field 100 meters above the primary hull. It appears that they were closing when the Enterprise fired phasers at point-blank range and destroyed the shuttle. Phelps started to get the damage report. The primary hull has been damaged in various areas by the explosion and debris. Radiation damage is also showing. All the bridge terminals are cut off. Bridge monitors show several electrical fires. At least some of the bridge crew appear to be alive. What about the Klingon ship? Kirk queried as the damage filtered through his mind. The damage was bad, but it could become much worse if the Klingon ship were to appear and open fire. It's not showing up on scanners, but if cloaked, it could be right off our bow and we wouldn't know it. He looked at Kirk. Sir, even the ship's phasers had hit the antimatter containment pod. The Dayton couldn't have exploded enough to cause this kind of damage without being right on top of us. Unless it was loaded with explosives and made a suicide run, Kirk replied. Those shielded containers, Phelps exclaimed. Looks like you were more than right. Kirk nodded grimly. He didn't like Henley, but he certainly hadn't wished for anything like this to happen. The double doors swished open as Spock, Scott, and Uhura ran through. Their faces wore puzzled but grim expressions. The doctor remained in sickbay until the emergency teams finished assembling, Spock said as he moved over to Phelps and Kirk. What happened, sir? Uhura asked as she automatically moved to the communications station. Henley didn't listen to my warnings, Kirk answered somewhat angrily. What's our shield and weapon status? 4 shields are out. The generator has been shorted. The aft shield generator is functioning, and I'm extending the rear deflector to cover the forward sections. Phelps frowned slightly. It's not much, but it's better than nothing. All weapons are functional except phasers on the upper saucer. Engines sustain only minimal damage, but warp drive is out momentarily. Scotty, Kirk ordered, get down to engineering and help out down there. Scott looked at Kirk and quietly moaned. Back down under, Scott thought. But the engineer knew that he couldn't let the ship down, or more importantly, let James Kirk down. Aye, sir. I just hope Maxwell follows my advice, sir. I'll make sure that he does, Captain Scott, Phelps replied in a flushed tone. You just go down and do what you can. Phelps turned to Uhura. Commander Uhura, can you give me engineering? Uhura nodded and quickly got Maxwell online. He was already trying to contact someone, but had vainly tried the main bridge. Ben, this is Phelps. What's your situation in engineering? Just minor overloads, getting warp power back online in a few minutes, he answered over a background of voices. What the hell happened? Looks like we got suckered into a trap. The bridge is completely cut off. Captain Henley and the bridge crew are probably badly injured, if not dead. We need to get out of here now, Ben. Then Phelps added, Captain Scott is on his way to help out down there. I don't need his help down here. We're doing fine, Maxwell's voice echoed back with some anger. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell, you will either accept Captain Scott's help down there, or you will find yourself helping him as the new chief engineer. He paused. The comm was silent. Unless you prefer to sit in your quarters for the rest of this mission. Do I make myself perfectly clear? Kirk looked at Phelps, then at Spock with a slight smile as Maxwell came back. Yes, sir. I will be more than happy to accept all the help Captain Scott can give. Phelps nodded and turned to Kirk. Now, Captain Kirk, unlike Captain Henley, I respect and appreciate your years of experience. Although I am now the acting senior officer, I prefer to hand command over to you. Logical, Spock said as he looked from Phelps to Kirk. Spock did not think it necessary to say that commanding the ship was Kirk's best destiny. Kirk nodded to Phelps. Very well, Commander. If you would handle the helm, Mr. Spock can man the science station. He looked over to Uhura. Commander, if you can man the navigation station until the immediate threat is over with. Uhura nodded as she moved to the navigator seat and looked over the console. She lightly ran her slender fingers over the smooth face of the console. It's been a while, sir. But at least the ship's designers were finding the benefit of having a standardized console module for the various stations, Uhura thought. It made emergency replacements for important stations much easier, especially during a battle situation. Captain, Spock called out as the ship suddenly lurched forward. Photon torpedo hit on the aft shield. The Klingon ship has the cloak behind us. Aft phasers are down, and aft shields have been reduced by 30%. Full speed ahead, Kirk ordered in Phelps' direction. Let's get as much distance between them as we can. The Enterprise moved forward under full impulse, gaining distance as the scout ship fired a disruptor volley before cloaking again. One of the energy beams scathed the shields off the starboard nacelle, causing the deflector to flash green for an instant. The stars became multicolored as the ship finally went to warp power, attaining speeds beyond that of light. Heading 78 degrees Mark 12. Speed is at warp 2, Phelps informed the captain. Engineering does not recommend that we go any faster for the moment. That last shot damaged some of the circuits for the flow regulators. Aft shields are down to 40%, and we can no longer extend it to cover the forward sections. However, repair crews estimate they will have the 4 shields back in about 7 minutes. Warp 2 is fine, Kirk responded. Then he turned back toward Spock. What about our adversary? Are they following? They disappeared from scanners when they engaged their cloaking device, Spock replied. We are heading out into open space, still within the triangle. However, there is the Toluca asteroid field at heading 310 degrees. Kirk smiled somewhat and nodded. Uhura, set course for that asteroid field. We'll use them for cover until we get back up and running. Pardon me, sir, Phelps said, but isn't that just as good as a place for them to ambush us? Yes, it is, Commander, Kirk nodded. But at least we'll have some cover until we get our shields back up. They can make a run for it. I doubt that scout ship will follow us into something like that. Still, he paused for a moment, turning back to the science station. Spock, is there any way that you can recalibrate sensors to detect that ship while it's cloaked? As you know, Captain, Spock replied, the cloaking device was built to negate that possibility. However, I shall attempt to do so. Commander Phelps, Kirk called. If we run into that scout ship again, fire photon torpedoes immediately, and follow up with phasers if necessary. We can't afford to get hit again. Aye, sir, Phelps responded. Dropping out of warp and going back to impulse. Range to the field, 200 kilometers. Uhura, plot the shortest course back into Federation space. Prepare to make a warp jump, Kirk said as he leaned in the chair and stared at the brown specks on the view screen. With some luck, we may just get out of this yet, Kirk thought. He frowned. He wouldn't be in this predicament to start with if Henley had listened to reason. Stay just close enough to the field to dive in for cover if we need it, Uhura, Kirk ordered, waiting for the Klingon to make a presence. The Federation ship neared a large asteroid when Spock called out. Captain, I am reading an area directly in front of us that has slightly higher gamma radiation levels than is normal for this region of space. It may be indicative of a cloaked ship. The source is 1.8 kilometers in front of us at 7 degrees Mark 3 and closing. Mr. Phelps, Kirk uttered, target the area that Spock has under scan and prepare to fire torpedoes. As Enterprise neared the asteroid, a section of space began to distort as the Klingon scout ship simmered into existence. "Fire torpedoes, Mr. Phelps," Kirk quickly ordered. Two of the antimatter missiles screamed out of the launch bays. The glowing red stars hit the Klingon ship before it had fully decloaked, or had time to engage its shields to protect itself from the damage. One torpedo detonated on the port engine support, blasting away from the ship in a blaze of sparks, escaping atmosphere and shrapnel. The other torpedo struck the upper portion of the secondary hull, just in front of the impulse vents. Secondary explosions from within the vessel caused a momentary burst of thrust from out the ruptured aft hull, causing the ship to pinwheel, offering the Enterprise a broadside shot. Phasers sliced through the unprotected hull layers of the starboard nacelle and its support assemblage, then bored deeply into the secondary hull. The scout exploded in a ball of energy, setting hull fragments careening through the area. The command pod was sent spinning off as the support boom separated from the ship's main hull, trailing gases and sparks until it impacted upon the surface of a nearby asteroid. A sigh of relief issued from Kirk as Phelps gave a slight cheer. That all faded as the Enterprise jolted forward again, sending Spock out of his seat while Kirk gripped the arms of the command chair. The ship listed to the port side slightly as the stabilizers were momentarily knocked out. Kirk jumped out of his chair to help Spock up from the deck. "Uhura, get a medic down here," Kirk ordered as he noticed a green splotch of Vulcan blood on the floor and on Spock's sleeve. Spock sat back down in the chair as though nothing had happened. The Klingon D-7 cruiser is decloaked behind us, and a D-18 Gull-wing destroyer has appeared in front of us off the port bow. Our shields are down, warp drive is offline, and there is minor damage to the starboard nacelle pylon. Both Klingon ships have all weapons charged, and their shields are up. The ship rocked backward slightly. Kirk gripped the railing next to Spock's station. That didn't feel right for a Klingon disruptor against an unshielded ship. Spock nodded as he checked the scanner. Disruptors were set on low power. Minor heat damage only. "They just want to show us that we're in between a rock and a hard spot," Kirk replied, as McCoy entered the bridge and looked around for injured. "Over here, Bones," Kirk motioned toward Spock. McCoy saw the green blood immediately. "How bad is it, Spock?" He moved over to the Vulcan and produced his medical scanner, proceeded to examine Spock's right wrist area. "I am not seriously injured, Doctor, and have no need for any of your potions," Spock commented without looking up from the sensor readout, and tried to ignore McCoy as he moved the uniform sleeve away from his wrist. "Well, Mr. Spock," McCoy replied in a somewhat contemptuous tone, "you are right about this not being a serious injury. 2 fractured carpals and a contusion with minor bleeding. But," he added as a hypospray hissed against Spock's arm, "since I don't tell you how to read a sensor scan, don't tell me how to practice medicine." Spock looked up and raised an eyebrow to comment, but said nothing in reply. McCoy wore his grim medical look as he used a protoplaser to seal the bones and blood vessels and finally the dermal layers. "Captain Kirk," Uhura called, "I'm getting a message from the captain of the cruiser Kataga." Kirk simply nodded that he had heard. "Spock, try to coordinate efforts and get those shields back up. Mr. Phelps, plot a course that will take us deep into the asteroids in the least amount of time, and prepare to engage impulse engines." Kirk ordered as he straightened his tunic. "Put him up, Uhura." The view screen flickered to show the bridge of a Klingon cruiser and its commander. Kirk studied the features of the Klingon captain before him. The rough face below the bony crown of the Imperial Klingon was made more profound by the scar that went from above the corner of the left eye across the cheek and nose to finally end on the right side of the chin. A fairly bad scar that the Klingon was no doubt proud of, Kirk thought. The standard leather uniform that he wore was somewhat more decorated than usual, with various plates of different colored metal and a sheathed knife openly displayed on the left shoulder. All in all, this Klingon looked more barbaric than most of the ones that Kirk had ever met. "Klingon Commander," Kirk began as he noticed his opponent had been studying him as well. "This is James T. Kirk of the Federation starship Enterprise," the Klingon cut in. "I know full well who you are, though surprised you are commanding the vessel that I have heard so much about." The Klingon straightened up slightly as he introduced himself. "I am Kaga. I see that your Federation has lied to us again. We were told that you had been relieved of your command and were no longer on active duty. Yet here you are in the Triangle, a neutral area of space, where you have destroyed one of the Empire's ships. Kirk, you will surrender your vessel to me, or be destroyed." Kirk muted the channel with a silent curse. Attacking their ships? Like hell. The Klingons were well known for starting battles, but often argued about their rights when the tide went against them. He looked over to Spock expectantly, hoping they had some good news. The destroyer by itself was no match for the Enterprise, with shields up, but with their deflectors down they could do some serious damage. The D-7 cruiser, on the other hand, was more than an even match for a Constitution-class cruiser with shields, but without them the Klingon cruiser would slice them to pieces. "Shields and warp drive are still down, Captain," Spock answered without being asked. Kirk frowned at that. Not unexpected news. "Mr. Phelps, best time to the asteroids." "About 20 seconds on full impulse, sir," he answered. "Of course we will have to reduce to quarter impulse or less once we enter the field with our shields down. It's going to be tricky maneuvering in there with those ships on our tails, and with full deflectors they'll be able to move much easier than we can. Have to avoid the asteroids like we will." Kirk frowned deeper, knowing full well what Phelps had just told him. With full deflectors, the Klingon ships could simply push aside some of the asteroids, while the Enterprise would have to either destroy them or move around their path to avoid damage. "Set course and prepare to execute on my command." Kirk switched the comm channel back on. "Captain Kaga, I have discussed your terms with my officers, and we have reached an agreement on your offer." Kaga looked somewhat surprised. This was nothing like he had expected from the famous Captain James T. Kirk of the Federation's flagship. Kaga gave an evil smile. "And what is your response, Kirk?" "Our response is that we would not surrender even if you were Kalas himself, and most certainly never to the likes of you. Good day." Kirk shut off the channel with a grim smile as the Klingon turned beige from anger. "Now, Mr. Phelps." The ship turned, heading for the brown haze of the asteroid field that lay off the starboard side. The sudden action caught the Klingons off guard. They were forced to adjust their weapons' target lock lest they fire upon each other. The destroyer fired first, its photon torpedo smashing into an asteroid ahead of the fleeing starship. The D-7 cruiser fired its disruptors, grazing the secondary hull just above the hangar bay, but causing no real damage. Its torpedo detonated on an asteroid that tumbled into its path. Such a rare chance is fortunate for the Enterprise, otherwise the torpedo would have directly struck the impulse engine vents. The Federation ship finally became surrounded by enough floating rock to provide ample cover. The Kataga shimmered into the darkness of space as it rose over the destroyer. The Gullwing, however, continued into the asteroid field in its pursuit of Enterprise. "Spock, report on the ships," Kirk asked. He looked back at the Vulcan. "The destroyer is following our course, and is slowly closing. Its smaller design allows for more effective maneuvering than our own vessel, but is probably staying back in fear of our aft weapons. The cruiser has gone off sensor scan, presumably to wait somewhere ahead of our present course." "Logical, Mr. Spock," Kirk replied. "Current ship status?" The Vulcan read off the displayed list of current updates from damage control. "Aft shields are still down. Repair crews estimate another 15 minutes. Aft phasers are at half power. Warp drive will not be possible for another 30 minutes. Forward deflectors are at 10%, expecting 80% in approximately 5 minutes. McCoy, who had yet to leave the bridge, moved down to the command chair. "Now what, Jim?" Kirk did not exactly jump, but was unnerved at the sudden outburst. He had forgotten all about McCoy being on the bridge. He looked up at the doctor. "Just like old days, isn't it, Bones?" McCoy nodded and gave a wry smile. "I was younger back in those days." Kirk didn't respond to the comment, other than take a deep breath before speaking. "Our problem is that cruiser, wherever it is." Commander Phelps suddenly turned to look at Kirk. "Hounds, sir." "Hounds, Commander?" Spock asked, wondering what the species Canis Familiaris had to do with their current situation. "That's what the destroyer is, sir," Phelps responded to the question. "The reason they are not closing as fast as possible is it doesn't need to or intend to do so. It's acting as the hounds, chasing us out into the open for the hunter." Kirk nodded. "Very good, Commander Phelps. Very good." Kirk gave an appreciative smile. "If that's what they're doing, then the cruiser is waiting for us just outside the field. That will be our target, Commander. We'll fire with everything that we've got and make a run for it before that destroyer clears the field." "Aye, sir," Phelps acknowledged with a slight smile. At least Kirk appreciated his advice. "Main phaser banks on full power, all torpedo tubes loaded." A beep sounded on his board. "Sir!" Kirk looked at the view screen. For a moment all he saw were chunks of rock, but then he saw the ominous dark shape just off the center of the screen. Phelps had been right. The cruiser had just decloaked and was waiting for them just outside the asteroids. Phelps checked his sensor scan. "Captain Spock, are your sensors detecting the same energy readings on the cruiser as mine?" "Indeed, they are, Commander," Spock answered as he studied the scanner more closely. "The cruiser has doubled their forward deflector shields." Kirk grimaced. Captain Kaga was taking no chances. He had shifted nearly all of the cruiser's aft shields to help cover the forward area of the ship. Although this left the aft of his ship virtually unprotected and reduced the starboard and port shields to less than a quarter power, it would add considerable protection to the forward area, which was the only place that the Enterprise would be able to target. With such protection, there was very little chance that the Enterprise's weapons would have any effect. "Is there any chance that we can try to double back around the destroyer and get out another way?" McCoy asked, a little worried. "Negative, Dr. McCoy," Phelps responded. "The destroyer is too fast for that. We are almost within its firing range now. We would simply give them a broadside shot before we could get under adequate cover. Besides," he continued, "with the cruiser outside of the field, they would simply maneuver back around with us, putting themselves in our path again." "All right, people," Kirk spoke. "Let's concentrate fire on that cruiser. Prepare to fire everything that we've got. This will be close. They have virtually the same weapons range as we do, but they have shields, and we don't. If we can just give them enough of a shock, we may be able to get far enough away before they can gather their wits and return the favor. Firing range in 92 seconds. All weapons locked, phasers up to full power, torpedo tubes loaded. Forward shields up to 45%. At least that's something," Phelps said as the cruiser neared the edge of the field. Kirk looked at McCoy with a somewhat worried gaze. His friends deserved better than this. McCoy met his gaze with a twinkle of blue eyes. He shrugged slightly at Kirk. "At least he's not quoting Shakespeare." Kirk only gave a grim, muffled laugh. Phelps' scanner suddenly beeped to life. "Sir, there's another ship decloaking behind the cruiser and heading this way at high speed with all weapons armed." "Put it on the view screen." The image shifted slightly to a point above the Klingon cruiser. At first, there was only the distortion of a cloaking field, but the distinct shape of the ship soon became visible. The new ship looked more like some type of spacefaring predator. A gaping, tooth-filled mouth had been painted on the underside of its command pod, a design Kirk recognized as being similar to some of the ancient warplanes of Earth's history, the Flying Tigers. The command pod was attached to the secondary hull by a boom, much like the Klingon ships. 2 engine nacelles were mounted on pylons that swept forward and down slightly, giving the appearance of wings. Projecting along the boom section were two smaller pylons that ended in some sort of tubular pods, of which Kirk could not identify. The center of the black mouth glowed red as a photon torpedo was readied and fired. He gave an audible sigh as he saw the path of the incoming torpedo. Its course was not for the Enterprise. The antimatter fireball detonated on what little amount of aft deflectors the Klingon cruiser had, since most of it had been transferred forward. The detonation immediately overloaded the shield generators, allowing for twin phaser beams from the previously unidentified pods that cut into the port engine nacelle and aft torpedo bay. As the energy beams sliced through the photon torpedoes stored in the bay, a huge explosion rocked the Klingon ship. The blast sent a large portion of the cruiser's main hull hurtling through space. The new ship continued on its diving course, speeding past the D-7 cruiser to send an aft torpedo into the command pod. With the deflectors having been destroyed from the first blast, the command pod had no protection. The forecastle exploded outward at the base from the full impact of the torpedo, blowing it away from the pod. The Klingon cruiser began to dip starboard aft as the mystery ship cloaked, fading like a specter of death as it soared over the saucer section of the Enterprise. The Klingon destroyer, having witnessed the events, pivoted and began to speed away from the area, using the asteroid from cover. "I don't know who that was," Kirk said, "but they made an opening for us. Full speed out of here." "Captain," Spock cut in quickly, "that ship was a modified Orion Wanderer scout ship." "Orion?" Kirk asked. "Belay that last order, Commander. If there's one Orion ship willing to take on two Klingon warships, you can bet there's more somewhere else. Take us close to the edge of the field, but stay in enough that we can get some protection, just in case." Phelps did as ordered. He certainly did not want to deal with any Orion pirates. They would never hit anything big like a Klingon cruiser unless they had ample backup, and if they were sure enough of themselves to single scout after two Klingon warships, they may have similar designs about the Enterprise. "Uhura, put the destroyer on the view screen." Uhura quickly switched its view of the fleeing destroyer. They could barely see its shape amongst the asteroids. The destroyer hit a clear area momentarily, then made a run behind a large asteroid that would lead out into open space. It was at that moment that the new ship materialized above and behind the destroyer, out of the Klingons' firing arcs. The scout dove towards the destroyer like a falcon, firing a heavy phaser barrage on the area of the command pod. The Klingon shields glowed red as they attempted to protect the ship from the deadly fire. The release of a brief flash sent a photon torpedo after the phasers, annihilating what remained of the Klingons' deflectors. The attacking ship continued its dive past the destroyer, letting loose another aft torpedo into the underside of its command pod. The torpedo hit dead center, causing the decks to explode out the top of the hull. The destroyer began to slowly drift back into the asteroid field as its executioner shimmered into invisibility again. "Spock, any readings?" Kirk asked nervously. The Enterprise was now the only remaining live ship. "Negative scan. Both Klingon ships have been rendered dead. I read no power sources or life aboard them." Spock looked at the view screen behind Kirk. "Whoever is in command of that ship knew where to hit the Klingons to cause the most damage with the least amount of time and energy expenditure." Kirk turned back to the screen and stared, hoping to strain his eyes enough to see the barely discernible but telltale distortion effect of the cloaking device. Nothing other than rock and the distant bulk of the drifting cruiser could be detected. Tense moments passed on the bridge, all in silence. Phelps' console sounded as the space in front of Federation distorted to reveal the killer ship facing them, its weapons fully charged.